Well, you know, the shutdown's over as of a few days ago, and that's kind of a relief, because I know I was certainly moved by great sympathy for the plight of the federal workers furloughed and not getting paid. I'm sure you were as well, and I'm sure they would be equally moved by sympathy for us had the shoes been on the other foot. I said in my last video that I was happy Trump was making noise about the wall. And I was, and I am, but it may have been too little, too late. You know, this was a fundamental campaign promise. This was one of his foundational campaign promises that he made to get elected. And he waited almost 2 years to start really making noise about it. He waited until after the midterm elections, when the Democrats are in control of the House. And that makes it infinitely more difficult. So it may ultimately prove to be too little, too late. Some on the right have totally abandoned him at this point. I'm not going to go that far. I think he does merit some criticism over this and other things. But, you know, he has pleasantly surprised me in the past, and I hope he will do so in the future. Although at this point, he's got to do a lot of work to regain my approval, because this isn't the only questionable decision he's made recently. This, you know, waiting until now to really push the wall issue. He's also recently appointed Elliott Abrams as his point man on Venezuela. And this is like a Bush-era Neocon stooge who was one of the authors of the Iraq War. And that's another thing that Trump campaigned against, were these kind of Neocon misadventures in foreign lands, where America is responsible for regime change and policing the world and overthrowing all these governments, toppling all these governments, and you know, creating chaos and instability to no apparent beneficial end. You know, the Iraq War, which Elliott Abrams was one of the authors of, was a terrible catastrophe for America and for Iraq. You know, it cost thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Iraqi lives. It led to the rise of ISIS. It's cost trillions of dollars. Some say $6 trillion before it's all said and done. You know, estimated to be the final price tag of the Iraq War, which would make the Iraq War cost $1 million for every member of Elliott Abrams' ethnic group in America. Which, by the way, a lot of the other authors of the Iraq War belong to the same tiny ethnic group as Elliott Abrams. And, you know, this is one explanation for why the U.S. undertook such a costly and pointless and destructive endeavor, and one that was foreseeably so, right? One that was predictably so, was simply because it benefited the interests of Israel by eliminating a regional power, a regional rival. And there's a connection between Elliott Abrams and Israel and a lot of the other authors of the Iraq War, which calls their loyalty into question. Doesn't seem to be fundamentally to America. And speaking of questionable loyalties, you know, one issue we were having back in October and November when the caravan was menacing our southern border, this caravan of invaders menacing our southern border, Trump asked the military for troops to provide security and logistics and support at the border. The Pentagon replied that they could provide the logistics and support, but they couldn't provide armed troops to defend the border because that is not within the scope of their lawful authority, as they understand it. Which is really freaking funny, because I thought that was pretty much the entire point of the military, or at least a big part of it was to defend America and its borders. So it's odd that they would see that as not being within the scope of their lawful authority. And I'm not talking about the troopers here, because I don't think this is their opinion, but a lot of these officers in the Pentagon seem to have very divided loyalties, very questionable loyalties, because they will march their troops off to fight a war for Israel, a country that does shoot civilians on its border trying to get in. Unarmed civilians, Israel will gun them down on the border. And our Pentagon officers, without hesitation, will send their troops to fight a war for Israel. But they don't consider defending the U.S. to be within the scope of their lawful powers, apparently. So, I guess there are a lot of Obama appointees in these positions. And Trump definitely has a lot of challenges to overcome, not just with the House, not just with the Senate, but apparently with the military as well, in order to get some of this implemented. So, I am critical. I am a little bit critical. I am a little bit unhappy right now about some of the things going on with Trump and with other people. Some on the right have totally written Trump off at this point. And I'm not going to go that far because he has pleasantly surprised me in the past. But he's going to have to work pretty hard, I think, to pleasantly surprise me in the future. And he's going to have to work pretty hard to pleasantly surprise enough people to have a shot at 2020. I'm not going to write him off. I'm not going to say he can't do it because he has surprised me before. And I know the government is scheduled to shut down again in a few weeks if they can't reach an agreement. But he did campaign on the wall, and that's something he has to deliver on, and he has waited until it's going to be very hard to deliver on. And, he did campaign on ending the Neocon wars. And those are kind of part and parcel of the same strategy of bomb the world, bring the world. Which doesn't make any logical sense unless you consider our final point, which there really isn't a political solution. So, I guess you can call me kind of a fence sitter on Trump because I'm willing to be critical of the guy, but I'm not necessarily going to totally write him off. I think he is better than the alternatives, particularly the Democrat ones. But we do have to remember that there is no political solution to this, and especially not, a democratic political solution. Because a lot of this stuff is baked right into the incentives and the logic of egalitarian universal franchise democracy. You don't even need an anti-Western ideology or a white genocide ideology. I think those things exist. There are people who consciously aim at those objectives, but you don't need that because it's baked right into the logic and the incentives of universal franchise democracy. You can import an endless stream of cheaper and cheaper replacement voters from third world countries, to loot and displace the traditional Americans, the established American citizenry. And you can do that, and it's a successful electoral strategy, and a profitable one, because you are getting cheaper voters that enable you to loot the wealth of, the more established, more expensive, more established voters. So it's a successful strategy, it's a winning strategy, and it's one that people are going to employ if you leave that door open in the incentive structure of democracy. And it's baked right into the incentive structure of egalitarian, universal franchise democracy. And so the solution fundamentally isn't political, and it fundamentally isn't democratic, because trying to achieve a democratic political solution to these kind of problems is like trying to fight a fire with gasoline. It's not the right tool for the job. You're only going to make it worse in the long run. So while I am upset with Trump about these things, and even though I do think he's better than others, the most he could ever do really was buy us time, because there's not fundamentally a political solution to any of this stuff. So what is the solution? Well, I'm sure you can imagine several. I think one good way forward would be white Sharia no-go zones, and ultimately maybe a white Afghanistan in some rugged mountainous region of North America. Somewhere where our people could have a homeland and can live in accordance with their values and among their own. And where outsiders, hostile outsiders, parasitic outsiders fear to tread. Anyway, more about that in another video that I'm going to upload for my patrons on Patreon, and the link is going to be below to my Patreon. Talk to you later.